else came, so I went home. That don't count?
That don't count.
Well, yeah, it counts,
Oh,
but not
okay.
Sure.
for anything else. So. Well, as the sheets are going around, we're finally going to get to Transfiguration Sunday. We did 7 weeks of Epiphany. It's one of the longest seasonal Epiphanies that we do. I think in my lifetime, there's only one time that we will go, maybe twice in my lifetime, that we'll go to 8 weeks with the season of Epiphany, and that's because that's where Easter falls in the year. So Easter's later this year. It's April 22nd, whatever that Sunday is. And so because of that, Epiphany is lengthened for that. But we'll be... Okay.
Bless you.
Twice.
Blow your brains
So
out.
we're going through the Transfiguration Sunday, and so these are the readings, the propers for the day, that are proper for that day. What I like to do is just go and start with the Old Testament reading first, and in Deuteronomy chapter 34, this is the end of the book of Deuteronomy. Just to let you know, Moses dies, so don't be shocked when we get to that part. But Moses dies in this, and Joshua takes over and leads the people into the promised land. Then Moses went up from the plains of Moab to Mount Nebo, to the top of Pisgah, which is opposite of Jericho, and the Lord showed him all the land. Gilead as far as Dan, Naphtali, the land of Ephraim and Manasseh, all the land of Judah as far as the western sea, the Negev, the plain, that is the valley of Jericho, the city of palm trees as far as Zorah. And the Lord said to him, "This is the land to which I swore to Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob. I will give it to your offspring. I have led you see it with your eyes, but you shall not go over there." So Moses, the servant of the Lord, died there in the land of Moab, according to the word of the Lord, and he buried them in the valley of the land of Moab, opposite Beth Peor. And no one knows the place of his burial to this day. Moses was 120 years old when he died. His eyes were undimmed, and his vigor unabated. And the people of Israel wept for Moses in the plains of Moab 30 days. Then the days of weeping and mourning for Moses were ended. And Joshua the son of Nun was full of the spirit of wisdom, for Moses had laid his hands on him. So the people of Israel obeyed him and did as the Lord had commanded Moses. And there has not arisen a prophet since in Israel like Moses, whom the Lord knew face to face. None like him for all the signs and the wonders that the Lord sent him to do in the land of Egypt, to Pharaoh and to all his servants and to all his land, and for all the mighty power and all the great deeds of terror that Moses did in the sight of all Israel. So that's the end of the book of Deuteronomy. Now, do you remember how many, I shouldn't say how many, what people got to go into the promised land? The Israelites, yes. But which Israelites got to go into the promised land? Well, let me ask you this. How many years were they in the wilderness wanderings? 40 years. And if you remember, God brought them out of their captivity in Egypt. He brings them to the promised land. Moses sends spies into the promised land. They're checking it out for 40 days. They come back. They go, "This is awesome. Grapes as big as our heads, pomegranates, all that kind of stuff. But the people are giants, and there's no way that we could ever conquer the land." Except Joshua and Caleb said, "Well, we can, because God's on our side. Remember God who took care of the Egyptians? What makes you think he won't take care of these people?" Well, they decided that they were not going to go in. Because of that, God was very angry with the people and said, "Okay, those people who are 20 years and older on that day will not be allowed to go into the promised land." So all those who are 20 years and younger, except for Joshua and Caleb, They were the only ones who were 40 and over, or 20 and older, that were allowed to go into the promised land. So a whole generation, 600,000 men came out of the Exodus. That means about how many million people might have come out? Maybe 3 million people came out of the Exodus. But only those who were 20 years and younger were allowed to go into the promised land. Moses was not allowed to go in. Does anybody remember the reason why Moses was not allowed to go in?
Because did he kill someone?
No, that's not the reason. He did kill somebody, but that's not the reason.
Okay. No, okay.
He did kill somebody, but that's not the reason.
Oh, I thought that's why
No.
God told him.
No,
Okay.
that's not the reason.
Okay,
God seemed to have forgiven that.
because he burned something?
No. What happened was, in the wilderness wandering, the people began to complain. We have nothing to eat and nothing to drink. So God sends manna, this bread type thing, every day. And then there's one time we're thirsty, and God says, Moses, I want you to take your staff and strike the rock, and the water will come out. And that's what happened. Sometime later, the people were whining and complaining again. Moses got sick of this. I can only imagine 3 million people whining and complaining to you. And God says, Moses, I want you to speak to the rock, and the water will come out. Guess what Moses did?
Took his cane instead, yeah.
So angry at you! And the water came out, and later on God said,
But you're not.
I
going.
told you just to speak to the rock. Because of that, you're not going into the promised
I
land.
didn't know that.
I didn't know that
I
either.
didn't know that.
Now we might think that's a little insignificant. Killing someone would be much bigger.
Yeah, because he
exactly.
broke one of the commandments.
Yes. But what was the commandment that Moses broke? Broke with this one.
Oh, he didn't obey.
Okay, he didn't obey, okay. Didn't
Number
God.
one, you have no other gods. You didn't listen to me, Moses. You didn't do what, in your anger, in your sin, you sinned. But God did something very special for Moses, and we read it here. God showed all the promised land to Moses. I have no idea how he did that. If he had a big monitor, I have no idea. The slideshow, I don't know. But Moses sees the whole, and this is this whole promised land. He says, Moses, you're not going to go into it, but you'll be able to see it. Because for 40 years, Moses is getting ready, these people ready to go into the promised land. And he finally gets there, but he doesn't go in. And he dies. He's 120. And this phrase in verse 7, his eyes were undimmed and his vigor unabated. In other words,
Hale and hearty.
oh yeah, he didn't die of old age. He didn't die. He probably could have went another, I don't know, 100 years. I don't know. But that's what it is. And then the Lord buries him. And I mean, we don't know where he's buried. Somewhere
That's strange.
in Moab, somewhere in there, that's where it is. Now, had a map. Sea of Galilee, Jordan River, Dead Sea, Mediterranean Sea. Here is Israel. Over in this part over here, there's a part of the region called Moab. So and there's mountains there so that they can look. So Moses was up on the mountain and he saw. So God let him see. What he
wasn't going to get.
Right. Well, see the promised land. I mean, this was,
He had to be disappointed.
Well, hold on to that thought. Hold on to that thought. Because it's not that he never goes into the promised land. He does. God does allow him to go into the promised land. So we're going to get that in a little bit. But not here.
Okay.
Not here. Yes.
Right, on your map of. Are you saying Moab is on the east side
Yes.
of the Jordan?
Yes.
Okay.
So it's up here. Moab, Egypt is down here.
Yeah.
That's what I wondered.
They must be related.
Yeah, they must be.
This is the promised land. Jerusalem will be down here. As we would understand in New Testament, this is Galilee up here. Over here is the land of Moab and Ammon. Down here, Egypt is over here, down here somewhere. Under here is where the the Amalekites lived, and so this is just the land of Moab and Ammon. Up here is what we would call present-day Iran and Iraq, so Persian and Babylon. So they're over here. Here's the Fertile Crescent. You would travel this way because this is all desert. Unless you have a lot of water and food, you would always travel because there's water and plenty of stuff up here. So you would come down here. So somewhere around here, and when I mean that he sees, Jericho is like right here. And you go read in the book of Joshua, you will hear that they will go into the land of Jericho. That's the first thing that they conquered. Do you remember, just a little side note, remember how they conquered the city of Jericho?
Yeah, Joshua fought the battle of Jericho.
That's the battle plan. You're going to walk around, and on the last day, you're going to walk around 7 times, and the last time around, you can make a lot of noise. And the walls will come down. Really? That's the plan? Yes, so that's how God did that. So that's what that is. Now, remember, the Moabites, the Ammonites, and the Israelites, they're all cousins. Israelites are the descendants of Jacob, which is their descendants of Abraham. Abraham had a nephew named Lot. When Abraham comes in, he comes down here, he brings his nephew Lot with him, and they didn't get along, or the men of Lot and the men of Abraham didn't get along, so they divided the land, and Lot took the other land because that's where Sodom and Gomorrah was. And if you remember what happened with Sodom and Gomorrah, they're destroyed, they're leaving the town, and Mrs. Lot becomes the pillar of the community. She turns into salt, she looks back.
Yeah, they never said her name. You have to call her Mrs. Lot because they never gave her a name.
You don't know this, but at one year you bought me a salt and pepper shaker of Mrs. Lot and Mr. Lot. Can you guess what goes in Mrs. Lot? So Lot leaves with his 2 daughters, Moab and Ammon, and they have children together. Interesting. So that's what that is. So that was it. We're also going to find, you're going to find out, well, I'm just going to tell you that who else is related to the Moabites?
We should know.
Well, hey, what's her name? I'm looking at you. What's your name? Ruth. Ruth. Who's Ruth?
You're related?
Who's Ruth? Ruth is
Yeah, she was a Moabite.
grandma
Yeah.
to King David.
Yeah, okay.
Because Ruth is with Naomi. During the time of the judges, there's a famine going on. Naomi goes to Moab with her husband and her 2 boys. All the men die, but Ruth decides she's going to come back with Naomi because she believes in God. She marries Boaz. Oh, what a beautiful love story. And so Boaz and Ruth have Obed, who then have Jesse, and Jesse has David. So I guess Ruth is great-grandma to David. So that's, David. So that means if David is a descendant of the Moabites, who else is a descendant of the Moabites? Jesus. Because Jesus is a descendant of David. So, yeah. So the land of Moab. I can put all that in there. Do your heads hurt yet?
Yeah.
Awesome. So we have this. So this story is just saying that, Moses sees the promised land, but he doesn't go into the promised land. Moses, and this is the key here. Verse 10, and there has not arisen a prophet since in Israel like Moses, whom the Lord knew face to face. None like him for all the signs and the wonders that the Lord sent him to do in the land of Egypt. Moses, if there's one thing that comes to mind about Moses, what is like the most important thing that when you think of Moses?
10 Commandments.
Yes, it's the giving of the law. He goes on Mount Sinai and gets the law. So that's what it is. In fact, that's its first 5 books. We call them, that's the law, the book, the Torah. I mean, it's not all law, but it's the law. It's the Word of God. It's law. And then you have the prophets, which is the rest of them. But Moses is seen as a prophet as well. I mean, the writer here, assuming that Moses died, that someone else wrote verses 9 and 10 and 11, that someone else did that. Or Moses wrote it before he died. I don't know. We won't know. It's one of those questions when they get to heaven. I'm going to ask Moses, did you write that or not write that? The original Hebrew lends itself that it was somebody else apart from Moses that wrote this, because the grammar's not the same. So it might be Joshua, but whatever. Doesn't matter. That Moses is, the Old Testament is Moses. Moses is the guy. So we have that. Now what I want you to do is jump down to the gospel reading in Luke chapter 9. This is Luke's version of the Transfiguration of our Lord. Now, about 8 days after these sayings, the saying is this. Jesus said to the disciples, "Who do people say that I am?" "Oh, da-da-da-da." "Well, who do you say that I am?" "Oh, you're the Christ, you're the Messiah." "Okay, let me tell you what that means. The Messiah, the Christ, is going to go to Jerusalem, he's going to suffer, and he's going to die, he's going to rise again. I mean, this is in chapter 9. Right before that is the feeding of the 5,000. Right before that is another miracle. And right before that is the first time Jesus says, "Oh, we're going to Jerusalem, I'm going to suffer, I'm going to die, I'm going to rise again." So when it says all these sayings, if you got to read it and knowing this is all going to happen. So about 8 days after these sayings, Jesus took with him Peter, James, and John, the inner three of the disciples. I mean, there's Peter, James, and John, then Andrew, the rest, up on a mountain to pray. And as he was praying, the appearance of his face was altered, and his clothing became dazzling white. And behold, Luke likes to use the word behold. Remember, Luke, this is Luke 2. And behold, there were shepherds, and behold, there were angels, and behold, he likes that. 2 men were talking with him, Moses and Elijah. And how do we know it's Moses and Elijah?
Because it says so.
Well, because it says here. But how did Peter, James, and John know it was Moses and Elijah? Because they had their AL name tags on. Moses and Elijah, who appeared in glory and spoke of his departure, which he was about to accomplish at Jerusalem. So Jesus is having this conversation with Moses and Elijah about his departure. The Greek word that Luke uses is the word exodus. It's literally his exodus. Now, when I say exodus, what comes to mind? Moses and them coming out of their bondage in, you could literally say, and his exit. You could say that. His departure, about what he was going to do. Now remember, Jesus right before this, the disciples heard this twice in this chapter. "Oh, I'm going to Jerusalem, I'm going to suffer, I'm going to die, and I'm going to rise again." So Moses and Elijah are talking with Jesus about his, you're going to suffer and you're going to die, and the good news, Jesus, you're going to rise again, and I'm sure that they threw in, and you're going to ascend into heaven like the rest of us. So you're eventually going to get to heaven. Now Peter and those who were with him were heavy with sleep, but they became fully awake when they saw his glory and the 2 men stood. I'm sure that they did.
Yeah.
A deep sleep. And as the men were parting, meaning Moses and Elijah, and I don't even know if they were going to walk away. I have no idea. It's another one of those questions I'm going to have when I get there. Peter said to Jesus, he just came out of he's sleeping. "Master, it is good that we're here. Let us make 3 tents, one for you, one for Moses, and one for Elijah." I like this. Not knowing what he said. In other words, Peter spoke before he thought. Not that any of us would ever suffer from that. As he was saying these things, a cloud came and overshadowed them, and they were afraid as they entered the cloud. And a voice came out of the cloud saying, "This is my son, my chosen one, listen to him." And when the voice had spoken, Jesus was found alone, and they kept silent and told no one in those days anything of what they had seen. Woo. Now, in Matthew and Mark's version, it says Jesus told them not to speak of this until the kingdom had been ushered in, meaning to the kingdom of heaven had been come into being. Because if you started talking about this, what would people think?
They were crazy.
Correct. What do you mean Jesus changed? What do you mean you saw Moses and Elijah? What do you mean you heard them talking?
Yeah.
So that's what's happening with that. So we have Jesus going up on a mountain to pray, which is very typical of Jesus. He's always praying. Interesting, he goes up on a mountain. When we know about Moses, he goes up on Mount Sinai. What do you know about Elijah?
He the one with the chariot? How that?
Well, yes, he did. I mean, he doesn't die. Moses
Right.
dies. Elijah doesn't die.
Right.
He's carried up in the whirlwind in the flaming chariot.
Right.
He went up to a mountain.
Correct.
and
Oh, he
listened for
went to a
this
mountain.
Which
found
mountain
small, still
Which
voice.
mountain did he go to?
Was it Sinai?
Mount Horeb,
Horeb.
or as we know it, Mount Sinai.
Oh, really?
So Elijah, after he does his battle with the prophets of Baal, remember that story? You know, everybody's worshiping Baal. Elijah says, I got a deal for you. Let's see who the true God is. Let's set up a couple altars and put sacrifices on it. But we will pray to our gods to send the fire to start it. And so he says, okay, God, Baal guys, you go first. And it's been all day and then nothing happens. And then Elijah says, okay, God, let's show your thing. Fire comes down from the sky, not only consumes the sacrifice, but the stones as well. And not only the altar that Elijah made, but the altar that the prophets of Baal made. And if you remember, he had them soaked with water. I mean, it was not like, oh. And so that's what happens. And then Elijah kills about 700 prophets of Baal that day. And after that, he's exhausted. And Jezebel, Queen Jezebel, wants to kill him. So he runs for his life. And he runs 40 days. 40 days he runs down to Mount Horeb. Mount Sinai. He gets up on the mountain. I'm done, God. Take my life. I'm done. That's his daughter. Just sleep. Here's something to eat. So, kind of this, and then he goes back. I mean, he gets refreshed, rested, fed, all that. So he goes back. So we have Moses up on a mountain, Elijah up on a mountain,
Jesus.
and Jesus up on a mountain. Now the mount that Jesus is not Mount Sinai. It's a different, it's probably farther north. I think it's north of the Sea of Galilee. But it's a mountain theme here. And he's talking to Moses and Elijah. If you ask anybody, any good Jew, what two people kind of summarize the whole Old Testament? Moses and the prophet Elijah. I mean, this is what it is. So they're talking about what Jesus is going to do, his departure, his plan of salvation. And with that, we think that Moses or Peter and James and John are hearing this. Oh yes. Do they get it? Probably not, because even though Jesus tells them, I'm going to suffer and die, I'm going to rise again on the third day. If you remember, did they believe that Jesus was going to rise on the third day, that Easter Saturday? No. What they're going to do to us? So that's what it is. So they're up there, they're having the conversation, and Peter doesn't want to leave. He likes this glory stuff. This is pretty cool. We'll build a couple tents. One for you, one for Moses, one for Elijah. This is great. Let's not leave. And then a cloud comes down. Well, what covered, when Moses was up on Mount Sinai, what covered the top of Mount Sinai when God was there? A cloud. When they dedicated the temple, Solomon dedicated the temple, guess what came in to the temple at the dedication? A cloud. What might the cloud represent? Or let me put this, who might the cloud represent?
God.
God, but God who?
The Father.
Or
Jesus.
the Spirit.
Holy Spirit.
Because you got the Father speaking, you got Jesus there, and you got the cloud. Now, where else have you heard, this is my beloved Son?
Baptism.
At his baptism. We started the season of Epiphany with his baptism, with the words at his baptism. The voice came from the sky, the dove came down, that was the Holy Spirit, and Jesus is there. So we have this beginning of the season of Epiphany with this revelation, and then we end with Transfiguration with almost the same words, but God adds one 3 more words. Listen to Jesus. Why would he say listen to Jesus? And not why? And how come you don't listen to Moses and Elijah?
Jesus is the
Most
teacher.
written word of God.
Well, that, or we associate Moses with the giving of the law. Can you be saved by keeping the law? Well, you could if you did it perfectly, but nobody can do it perfectly. So the law, you're always going to fall short in your salvation. Jesus comes and gives us something even better, which leads us to the epistle reading from Hebrews chapter 3. We don't know who wrote Hebrews. Could be Paul, could be Apollos, or could be somebody else. Obviously that would be if it wasn't the two of them. But the book of Hebrews, kind of the way it's set up, it's you get the picture that there's the divine worship service going on, divine service is going on. And how Jesus is our great high priest, he's praying for us, he's making the sacrifices for and we as his people. And by the time we get to chapter 3, the writer is trying to tell us, yes, we have Moses and the law, which is important, very important, but there's someone who supersedes that, and that's Jesus and the gospel and what he's done for us. So just keep that in mind. Therefore, holy brothers, you who share in a heavenly calling, consider Jesus the apostle and high priest of your confession. What does the word apostle mean?
Teacher?
Christ.
Close. Sent one.
Oh, sent.
Sent one, okay.
There are many disciples, but only 12 apostles. And those were the 11 plus Matthias. They were the sent ones. These are the ones that hung out with Jesus. These are you have the disciples that you and I are, but Jesus he is the sent one. He's the one whom God sent for our salvation. And he's also the high priest. What does the high priest do? What does the priest do? In the Old Testament, made the sacrifices, prayed. So Jesus is, and before this and after this, the writer says you have a great high priest who sympathizes with you because he knows exactly what you're going through, and and he's making an intercession for you. He's praying for you. So we have that of your confession. Verse 2, who was faithful to him who appointed him? Now I want you to cross out was faithful and write in is being faithful. Because in the Greek it is a present tense. It's not a past verb. It's a present tense. It's happening now. Who is being faithful? Even now, being faithful to him, meaning God the Father, who appointed him. Just as Moses also was faithful in all of God's house. Now, Moses, not only did he get the law, but what else did Moses build? Or at least it's built under his watch, where they worshipped. What did they call that? The tabernacle, yes. And that's where God was. And if you remember, Moses would go into the Holy of Holies and have a conversation with God, and he would come out. That's where there was no one like him who knew him face to face. So Moses, the tabernacle, that was the tent that they, used until Solomon built the temple. So, faithful in God's house, the tabernacle, but also the whole house of Israel, kind of all the people. Verse 3, for Jesus has been counted worthy of more glory than Moses, as much more as the builder of a house has more honor than the house itself. For every house is built by someone, but the builder of all things is God. So what the writer is saying here, yes, you have Moses, and he was given the tabernacle, but guess who? The next question, who is the tabernacle? It's Jesus. Which goes back to John chapter 1. In the beginning was the Word, Word was with God, Word was God. Verse 14, and the Word became flesh and dwelt among us. The word that John uses, and dwelt among us, is the word for tabernacle. He tabernacled with us. He is the tabernacle. When the children of Israel, when they woke up, got out of their tents, they would see the pillar of fire or the cloud, and there's the tabernacle, that's where God is. So they go, oh, there's God. God's always with us. God's watching over us. That's done away with. The tabernacle is Jesus, who's always with us. Just
Emmanuel.
exactly. Exactly. Verse 5. Now Moses was faithful in all God's house as a servant to testify to the things that were to be spoken later. So just, the giving of the law and all that goes along with that. But, I like verse 6, but Jesus is faithful over God's house as a son. Go back to verse 5. Moses was faithful in all God's house. Jesus is faithful over God's house as a son. So when Moses is a servant, and a very important servant, really who has more standing in a household, the servant or the son? The son does. And we are his house, we, the church, if indeed we hold fast our confidence and our boasting in our hope. So we have Jesus and Moses and Elijah up on the mountain, and they're talking about what Jesus is going to do. Moses and Elijah are very important, but Jesus is over them. And that goes back to earlier on in the book of Hebrews, where the writer says, you got mankind, you got angels, then you got Jesus. Jesus is over all. So the pecking order there, if you want to put it that way. So this is it. So the Jewish people are still holding on to Moses. He's still important, but Jesus is not a servant, at least not to God the Father. He's a son, so he's over all of that. And so you have this wonderful kind of, my picture of what's happening here. Now going back to the gospel reading, and in verse 35, this is my son, my chosen one, listen to him. What does Jesus have to say to us? What does Jesus give to us as opposed to Moses and Elijah?
Everlasting life.
The gospel, the good news. That you're not saved by what you do or you don't do, you're saved by
Believe.
what Christ has done for you. Yeah, faith in what Christ has already done for you. And that's the key. That's, listen to Jesus, and we here at 9:36. Now if you had your Bible, and I would have you go down in chapter 9, verse 51. It's a key verse in Luke's gospel. And it says this, and Jesus turned his face toward Jerusalem. And they say, what's so important about that?
That's where he enters.
Well, I like to say, Jesus is a man on a mission. Remember, what did they talk about? What did Moses and Elijah and Jesus talk about up on the mountain? His exodus. In other words, the plan of salvation, whom Jesus has been telling his disciples, I'm going to suffer